Well, hi there. It's 10 a.m. here in Alaska. I believe that means that it's around 2 p.m. in your neck of the woods. I'm Lillian Lennon. I am from Anchorage, Talkeetna, and my pronouns are she, hers, they, them. I think that, yeah, it looks like people are tuning in, so I guess we could get right into it. For people just joining us, again, my name is Lillian Lennon. I'm from Anchorage and Talkeetna, Alaska. My pronouns are she, hers, they, them, and I'm a 22-year-old genderqueer activist, conversion therapy survivor, and have worked for such organizations as the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, Choosing Our Roots, and Trans Leadership Alaska, including several issue and candidacy-based campaigns here in state. And I'm here to talk about LGBTQ plus, the LGBTQ plus community, and touch on some of the basics of queer theory. So, thanks so much for joining me. Because I'll be starting at the foundation of the LGBTQ plus community, let's talk about some of the terminology. Just in case you're unaware or just need a refresher, LGBTQ plus stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and the plus implies that there are more identities to account for. Some examples include sexual orientations such as pansexual, asexual, demisexual, graysexual, and the romantic counterparts such as panromantic, aromantic, etc. These also include gender identities such as non-binary, agender, gender fluid, genderqueer, and two-spirit. This by no means is an exhaustive list. These are just examples. The reason we differentiate this community from others is to highlight the sexual, romantic, and gender minorities from cisgender and heterosexual majorities. And before we move on, it's important to note that you can be heterosexual or cisgender and be a part of this community. For instance, a lot of gender expansive people are heterosexual, and a lot of sexually or romantically expansive people are cisgender. People who are both heterosexual and cisgender are not inherently queer, but they're totally valid allies. We need more of those people. So, some quick definitions of terms I've used earlier. Sexual orientation refers to the gender or genders that we are attracted to sexually. Romantic orientation is the same, except it is who we're attracted to romantically. And gender identity is how we see ourselves and express our gender to others. So we're not necessarily, I mean, we are who we are. We are gender identity, but it's also performative. We do gender. That's part of queer theory that we'll get into later. Sex, on the other hand, refers to the biological characteristics that generally tend to classify us as male or female at birth. None of these are inherently linked. Biological sex does not determine one's gender, and gender does not determine one's sexual or romantic orientation. Your gender and orientation relies solely on how you see and express yourself. Our culture is predominantly cis-heteronormative, meaning that cisgender people, people whose identity corresponds to their sex assigned at birth, and heterosexual people, men who are attracted to women and women who are attracted to men, hold the majority of the power. Cisgender and heterosexual identities are normalized and anticipated, whereas LGBTQ plus identities are marginalized and questioned. That's why we often feel compelled to come out, fight for our basic human rights, and often assimilate and normalize our identities rather than fighting for a progression of a cause. We're trying to become the same as everyone else. So, branching a tiny bit into queer theory, let's first talk about the term queer. The word queer was used primarily during the 1800s and early 1900s to describe something as strange or odd. By the mid 1900s, the term had taken on a role of an abusive slur towards the LGBTQ plus community, meaning approximately the same thing. Between the 1980s and 1990s, the LGBTQ plus community began to reclaim the word as an umbrella term to describe sexual, romantic, and gender minorities. But it didn't come into widespread popularity until the early 2000s. I identify as queer, but still some of our older generations mainly associate the term with harassment and abuse, which is absolutely fair. It's important to be mindful of certain connotations these words can have, but it should not restrict us from self-identifying as queer. Now, queer theory is a dialogue of the nuances and intersectionality of queer identities. A lot of this involves the construction of gender, how gender is essentially performed, and intersections of race and class, and how we classify gender and sexuality. For instance, advocates and academics often attribute a spectrum to gender and sexuality where our attraction exists between straight and gay, and our expression between male and female. Between these 2 points is a line with a middle ground. Often I see bisexual as the middle point of sexual orientation, that spectrum, and non-binary in the middle of the gender spectrum. I'm here to tell you that that's absolutely bogus. As our understanding of gender and sexuality has shifted, we have grown more inclusive and forward-thinking in our teaching, but we have never been fully right in our understanding of gender and sexuality, as they are fluid and ever-changing concepts. It used to be taught that gender is immutable from your sex assigned at birth, and that your sexual orientation is tied to your gender, that you must only feel sexual and romantic attraction to the person of an opposite gender. We have a common saying in the queer community, namely, burn the binary. Essentially what it means is that we desperately need to rid ourselves of the gender roles and stereotypes that have plagued our community and our society. The same saying holds true when discussing gender identity and sexual orientation as a spectrum, a line between 2 points. A spectrum is binary with 2 points on either side, and for anything to exist, it is required to fall somewhere between those points and on that line. Logically, then, wouldn't any sexual orientation have to be some combination of gay and straight, somewhere in the middle, borrowing from either side? And wouldn't every gender for any gender on this spectrum have to be some combination of male and female? Addressing gender for a moment, how could non-binary, a absolutely valid gender, a very real part of this community, how would that be able to fall as a midpoint between male and female if non-binary identity's sole existence relies upon negating the roles of male and female or masculine and feminine identities? How could agender, gender fluid, gender nonconforming, gender queer, two-spirit, or third gender identities possibly exist between 2 points, male and female? While some could argue that gender fluid, for instance, bounces, ebbs, and flows between these 2 points depending on the day, gender fluid is an entirely different classification of gender. that exists outside the bounds that we've created. And where would we even put agender, for instance? The same exact issues exist with sexual attraction and romantic attraction. Pansexual, asexual, demisexual, gray sexual, and the umbrella term queer and their respective romantic counterparts all cannot. So the list goes on, of course, and this issue affects nearly every gender identity and sexual orientation that doesn't fall on either side of the spectrum or directly in the middle. So many of the concepts of queer theory and identity comes from cishet or cisgender heteronormative understanding of sexuality and gender. This is why it's important to hear from the affected communities, in this case the queer community, how these understandings can be harmful and why we need to rethink queer. In my own experience, I've described the relationship between sexuality and gender identity and our understanding and conceptualizing of it as an amorphous blob. Unfortunately, that is not a term that's highly accessible. It's hard to explain, but we've tried to come up with so much terminology to describe such a fluid concept when really, when gender and sexuality are so fluid and so variable, why would we try to attribute such a constrictive boundary when it comes to gender and sexuality? That's why I choose to describe it as something more nebulous. Others have tried to describe it between of course, the spectrum or a graphical axis, but there's no real way to pin down gender and sexuality within such a diverse community. I hope everyone's kept up so far. I don't know if I have any questions on what I've discussed so far, but I'm more than happy to answer anything. I have more content, but I want to see if everyone's understanding so far. No worries. We'll have more time for Q&A and such if y'all have any questions. Backtracking a bit to how we got here, we find ourselves in a very interesting time where we're both on the brink of basic human rights for LGBTQ plus folks across the world, as well as really struggling. I know here in the United States, we have been going through a tumultuous 4 years of the Trump administration. Very hard for gender expansive and sexually expansive identities in particular, especially with so many intersections within that community and such a racist state. Unfortunately, I'm not entirely familiar on where everyone else is out in the world, so I can really only speak to the United States with true fluency. But we find ourselves in an interesting time, nevertheless. I think that it's important to backtrack to how we got here. One important note is that it's interesting because we started in our feudalist state, centuries ago, having to rely on people and reproduction to create a working force and to create the means of production for people across the world. It was before capitalism, and we relied on reproduction in order to keep this system alive. In order for the system to continue, you needed the typical nuclear family. You needed to reproduce in order to have children, and in order to have free labor. Women were used to work. Children were used to work. And it wasn't until capitalism that this sort of started to shift. Of course, a lot of people were kept into these dynamics where still, women were assigned to certain work now, which was mostly to stay at home and take care of children, and uh, the men held most of the power. Of course, when capitalism came along, we saw that shift, and it really only helped a select few in a select number of ways. When it pertained to the queer community, it didn't help many people at all. It specifically helped the cis-normative heterosexuals, but the first rights that we saw were for cis white gay men, and we still see that pattern continuing today, as the leaders of the losing my train of thought. What I'm trying to disseminate is that the patterns that we're seeing in which queer people have been discriminated against and oppressed started within a feudalist state, when we were supposed to, the only reason we existed was to keep up the means of production and to provide for a community, to provide for the state. If you weren't able to reproduce, you weren't of value. And since then, that's been recognized and perpetuated through our systems. We haven't been able to escape it because through capitalism, it's only serving a select few, and unfortunately, we're finding it ever and ever harder to escape it. For instance, rainbow capitalism, in which corporations come in and try to preach that they're all for LGBTQ plus rights and identities, but are only helping a select few in a select number of ways. The pioneers, I suppose, of the LGBTQ plus movement have always been trans women of color since the beginning. But we're seeing ever more focus away from the roots of protest, of intersectionality, towards rainbow capitalism and hiding away some of our most marginalized communities. I can give an example. During the Proposition 1 campaign here in Anchorage, Alaska, when we were fighting to hold on to our rights for transgender individuals, we were talking about how do we convince the public of Anchorage to support trans rights. We're conservative. We are very libertarian. How do we center this discussion? And we, at first, to be quite honest, I heard that they weren't wanting to center trans people into this discussion about trans rights. They said it's too racy. It's not palatable enough. We had to stray away from the issue of trans rights in a trans rights discussion in order to talk about things that shied away from the root of the issue. It's the same when it comes to marriage equality, when it comes to LGBTQ plus rights. We need to be in this for all, but when we're choosing to highlight only affluent, white, cisgender gay men in the fight for LGBTQ plus rights, we're doing our entire community a disservice. We need to be more inclusive of the community as a whole, and to not just stop at the fight for marriage equality. For instance, after the fight for marriage equality, I do apologize. I'm getting a call, and I don't know why. In the fight for marriage equality, here in the United States, by and large, we won. We achieved equal marriage for same gender couples. But after that fight, we saw a giant dip in the amount of buy-in from the cis gay community when it came to fights for our protections, for trans people, for non-binary people, asexual people, bisexual people, and pansexual people, etc. We desperately need more allies within the LGBTQ plus community. For the LGBTQ plus community, it's quite troublesome to witness so many transphobic, biphobic, or etc. Racist people within the LGBTQ plus community, when we ourselves are already so oppressed and discriminated against. We can't afford it. So I don't know. I'm gonna take a look at the chat and see. I'd like to see if there are any questions, because it looks as though I might have rambled and run over. I am open to questions, though, so feel free to put them in the chat. Yeah, I see that someone said, Sabina, I believe, love the idea that everything does not fit between two spectrums, used to refer to gingerbread person, but it was not perfect. Yeah, it's absolutely, we have a lot of concepts to describe ideas within the queer community and outside of it. And not all of them are perfect. I think that it does us a great service to try to explain some of these ideas to our cishet allies. But at a certain point, when we're compromising the truth of what it means to be queer, and using language described and founded by cis hetero people, we're not setting ourselves up for the long term. We're teaching people a compromised idea and not reaching higher to say, well, what about this? What about thinking of gender more fluidly? Instead, we're trying to put it into these tight little boxes so that cis-het people can understand, when in fact we should be trying to help the queer community most, advance and understand themselves. That's my take on it anyway. A lot of people might say differently and say that we just need to work for non-discrimination rights and for cis-het people to understand. But I don't know. I put our community first when it comes to explaining these concepts. There's a huge debate about, does asexual fit in the 2S LGBTQ plus community? What are your thoughts? Just to clarify, 2S, I believe, stands for two-spirit. And asexual fitting within that queer community, I mean, I think that should absolutely be up to the asexuals. I'm not asexual myself. As I believe that it is a sexual minority, and they're discriminated against in the same way that many queer people are, whether it's a gender identity or sexual orientation, I think I welcome them. I know very many asexual people that feel comfortable within the queer community, but still think that not enough of it is discussed and feel discriminated against by their own community. So I think they belong, but that's in the end up to that community. Some people are traumatized by the word queer and suggested to me that we can call them rainbow people. I actually have never heard the term rainbow people. My main drawback when it comes to highlighting rainbow within the queer community is that it seems to only highlight gay. And I have nothing against the gay community whatsoever. They're a part of this community just as I am, but we aren't the gay community. We're the queer community. We're the LGBTQ plus. It bothers me. It bothers me personally that that so much of the time we limit ourselves in our understanding of a very vast and diverse community, and consider gay to be the end all be all, and demonize straight people, for instance, as a result. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, there are plenty of straight people within this community. They're generally gender expansive, though. So I haven't heard rainbow people. I think I'd be open to it. I do love queer, though. I think that in the end of the day, it's a self-identifying term. So use what's comfortable for you. So that's what I use, but I'm of course open to other possibilities. Because gender is fluid, should we use a label like LGBTQ plus or some other way to describe the conversations? I don't know if I'm entirely understanding your question, but I think we can get more expansive than LGBTQ plus. For instance, it highlights only a few communities and leaves out so many. Asexual, agender don't even have a stake in that. Most other identities that exist don't even have a stake in it unless you're referring to the plus. So I think we need a more inclusive term, like queer, which is why I use it. But as far as gender fluidity goes, I think that we need more understanding of. I think we need more understanding from the community of how fluid gender and sexuality are. For instance, they can differ, for quite a few people over the course of their lives in both gender and sexuality. How you feel, because it's entirely subjective. Some people object to being called an alphabet soup. I get it. Yes, it's a lot sometimes, and we keep adding to it. That's again why I use the term queer. Discuss the term agender. Yes, I can discuss that briefly. That's essentially not identifying with any gender in particular. So it's not even within the amorphous blob. It's not even within the spectrum, which is a part of the problem with the idea of the spectrum. It's basically being genderless, although there are a lot of people that feel differently about the term or how they identify with it, but it's essentially not existing within femininity or masculinity or anything in between or anything that has anything to do with gender. It's just agender, not gendered. We are the alphabet mafia. Sorry, I didn't mean to ignore your comment. Let's see. It definitely is less of a mouthful. And I did not know that there was not a term for queer in French. I don't know. Maybe it's time that that a term is adopted, or that, I don't know. Is there a term for queer, like meaning, like the old meaning, like strange or odd in French? I'm curious about that. I don't practice French. Um, CFUW London, should we say all genders or gender continuum? That's certainly more inclusive than saying something else like, opposite gender. For instance, when people are referring to heterosexuality, it's generally the definition is one attracted to the opposite gender. Whereas if you noticed earlier, I said it was men attracted to women and women attracted to men. So yeah, generally all genders or gender continuum is more inclusive. I do have a special place in my heart for amorphous blob, though. Dave Stacy, oh, thank you. What is the most important message for youth? I let's see, off the top of my head, um, from my perspective, I'm an activist. I think that um, what is the most important message for youth? I wish I had something off the top of my head. I think the best that I can come up with right now is, essentially that uh, I don't know. I think that there's a lot of ways that youth can get involved in this work, and um, really like finding I don't know finding a mentor, finding someone to work with, finding a community is going to be the most important thing in delivering your message and being successful in this work. I couldn't have done any of what I've done without a community backing me. And I'm lucky for that. So find some people who are in with you on the cause and build a community out of it. It's extremely important in investing in any of this work. And no worries. Most important message for seniors. Let's see. Unfortunately, I'm not a senior, so I can't really speak from that perspective. I can try though. I think that. Oh, geez. Let me think on that. If I come up with something, I will circle back to this. Let's see. Allosexual and altersexual in French. I'm not familiar with those actually. Yeah, I'm not entirely certain. But thank you for bringing those to my attention. Yeah. I'm trying to circle back and see if I have any important messages for seniors. Anything. Oh geez. Yeah, I really wish I did. I I know quite a few seniors within this community who find a lot of I don't know, find a lot from within the community, but also have some struggles. Um, I think that times are moving fast. Terminology even faster. Um, and I think that it's important that we both look to them for guidance, because they've brought us into into this time and space we're in now and done so much work to help us get where we are, and we need to honor them for that. But we also they also need to be open, hopefully, into getting adjusted to how things are now, because so much has changed. For instance, we talked about the term queer. It's going to mean something different for everyone. And if you grew up having that hurled at you because you're gay or trans or whatever, that can be extremely hurtful and hard. But understanding that you don't have to use that term yourself is important, and that other people can use that term if they'd like to. So I think that just we need to be helping each other. I hope that helps answer your question. I wish I had something better. All right. Any more questions before we close out? I want to thank you all for joining me here. I hope that I communicated something helpful. Any more questions before we close up? All right. Let's see. Thanks, Lillian, for your honesty. It's just seniors, sometimes they find they have to go back into the closet after decades of activism and living openly. They feel that they have to hide themselves when they are older, especially if they need care or institutional help in unfriendly facilities. That's very valid. I hadn't thought much to that, but no, that's that cuts deep. Yeah. And yes, I can share my contact info. You can, feel free to message me or tag me or whatever on social media. My handle on Twitter, Instagram, and Twitter and Instagram is at ms Lillian Lennon. And my email is the same, except it's mslillianlennon@gmail.com. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions following this talk, or want to get in touch. And sorry, Dave had a question about let's see. Sorry, did I miss a question from you, Dave? I hope not. CFUW London toolkit for exactly this reason. I would love to help. Yeah, anything that I can offer. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, neighbors, friends, and families, ending domestic violence together, for both tagging me in the chat there and for having me on this talk. Please check out their social media, their website. They do a lot of awesome work, and I'm just so grateful to have had this opportunity to talk with you all today. I wish I had better rehearsed it. I had a teleprompter out here I was struggling to make work earlier. Did not end up happening. Yes, thank you all for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. I'm just beginning mine. It's 10:37 a.m. in the morning here. And take care. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, and I'll play you out. Who is my hero? Oh geez, who is my hero? I think that I think my hero, when it comes to my work in advocacy, and it may sound cliche, it may sound typical, but I truly admire Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. Both fantastic people. I wish we had more people like them in our movement today. Unfortunately, it's all higher class and white gay men running things now. We need more diversity and more action, certainly. All right, that was the last question, I suppose. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Love you all. Yes, #authenticity.